Ah. Hmm.
Okay. Tonight's presentation is by Phil Kelton on Memoirs of Telescope Addicts. Phil has got his PhD in computer science and astronomy from University of Texas at Austin in 1979. He had a 32-year career with McDonald Observatory, during which he was a programmer, I assume at the beginning, computing system manager, assistant director, and superintendent for the last job. After retiring in 2007, Phil continued to be involved in public outreach, especially as a National Park astronomy volunteer, primarily at Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. Phil has also engaged extensively in astrotourism and enjoys experiencing astronomy and telescope history firsthand, especially in France, and doing public talks on these travels of his. Phil, please proceed with your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Mehmet. First of all, it's a pleasure to be doing this. Let me begin by saying, repeating a little bit what I said earlier. I've been a member of DAS for just under 1 year now. And the reason I joined was that my daughter and her family moved to Denver about 1.5 years ago. And she's got 2 small kids, so we've been traveling to Denver a lot, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so. So I joined DAS to learn about astronomy in Denver and to get involved. So this particular talk, I worked up last summer because, as he said, I've been a volunteer at Black Canyon and Gunnison for about 12 years now, and for about the last 8, every summer I've been doing a talk for them. And so this talk is pretty much the same thing I did back in August in Western Colorado. The picture you're looking at is from McDonald Observatory, where I worked for a long time. I took this in July when I was out there, and that's the 107-inch telescope dome underneath the Milky Way. And that's one of my favorite telescopes on the professional side. And you'll be seeing quite a bit about that as we go on. I broke the talk up into 5 parts. So it's kind of chronologically organized, interspersing things I've done as an amateur astronomer for the last 6 decades, along with things I've done professionally in the professional world. The first part, the early days when it'll look pretty primitive, but I got really interested in astronomy when I was young and telescopes. Then as a graduate student at the University of Texas. The third part is most of my career with McDonald. The fourth part is about 4 different interesting international telescope adventures I had. And the last part is some things I've been doing since I retired. So let me proceed. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the first part is the early 60s to 1974. And each of these 5 things, I list some of the things I was involved in. Did a lot of ATMing with different kinds of telescopes, especially Richfield, apodizers and Schmidt correctors I got involved with, and folded optics. So the way I got into astronomy in the first place was in 1962, I found a pretty famous book called Frontiers of Astronomy by Fred Hoyle, just sitting around my house. I think it was my older brother's book, but anyway, I read that book, got very interested in astronomy. And for some reason, I still have 2 copies of it. And so I went out pretty soon thereafter, saved up $30. And on the left is the ad for Edmund Scientific Telescope 3-inch reflector, the Space Conqueror. So I bought one of those. You could see a little bit with it and use that some. And so that was my first telescope. Then after 4 years, when I got out of high school, I got interested in astronomy some more, saved up some money, and had this massive upgrade to the Super Space Conqueror 6-inch f8 reflector. I bought all the parts from Edmund and did some other work and put this together. And so that was my second telescope, and those were pretty much the standard of the day that a lot of people had. This is an ancient photograph showing you that telescope on the old Edmund mount and my 6-inch reflector. And it was pretty good in its day and kind of standard. Okay, the next telescope I made in the late 60s while I was in college, these two books were two of the books I had. There was a series called Amateur Telescope Making with all kinds of reprints of interesting articles from the early part of the 20th century, and another one called Telescopes for Sky Gazing. And as a result of these two books, I got really interested in Richfield telescopes. And that ATM book two had a really neat article near the end about Richfield telescopes. And what the basically what the article did was go through an argument about how if, for different sized telescopes based on the statistics of stars in the Milky Way, how you could construct a telescope and see the maximum number of stars in one field of view for a given aperture. And it turned out that aperture was around 3 inches at the time. So I decided to go out and make a 3-inch Richfield telescope. So this article was really seminal in me continuing with my telescope activities. And I like this picture, so I threw it in. Shows Clyde Tombaugh in the early days with his two telescopes, his handheld Richfield telescope and his long focus telescope. And there was a wonderful passage in there about Cygnus and to quote a few lines, perhaps the most beautiful and richest star fields to be found for an instrument like this are in the Cygnus region, and it waxes poetic about Cygnus. And you see the Milky Way in the bottom, so I decided to go out and make an RFT. And the other book I showed you by Dr. Paul showed an interesting picture where on the left, on this nice refractor, he showed his 3-inch RFT of 10 to 12 power. And so I kind of used that as my inspiration. And this is what I call my comic relief slide from about 50 years ago. Don't laugh, back in the hippie days. And this is the RFT I made with a Jaegers Edmund lens. I machined a little focuser, used a Richfield, not a Richfield, a 32 millimeter war surplus Erfel, some hose clamps, and polished it all up and anodized it. And that was the third serious telescope that I had. The fourth telescope out of these 6 in my earliest days is shown in this. It was a 6-inch f5 Jaegers refractor. And I figured if a 3-inch RFT was good, a 6-inch would be even better. So I bought the lens from Jaegers, put it all together, put my 3-inch RFT on it, used my old Edmund mount, and put this together. This was a pretty cool telescope. And at the bottom, you'll note that back in those days, there weren't many vendors and you couldn't buy much and people didn't have much money. So we made a lot of things.
Okay?
And,
Are you doing okay?
and so,
Okay.
so you'll notice that I actually made a diagonal for this out of wood, and it's got a 45-degree mirror in it on some springs for adjustment. And you couldn't even buy good diagonals in those days. On my mount, I used my barbell weights to make it have enough counterweight, so on and so forth. So it was really quite the unique telescope. One of the things that telescope had was a huge amount of chromatic aberration. It was great for low power. And I'd read an article on Scientific Telescope from a number of years earlier about making something called an apodizer from the amateur scientists and Scientific American. So I decided to make a few of those. Now, mathematically in optics, apodization is a theory about how diffraction results from sharp edges, such as the edge around an objective lens. And this is a crude way to simulate that by letting progressively more light through until you get to the center part of the aperture. So you put that in front of the telescope and it throws spectra out into the edge, but it cleans up the diffraction pattern in the center a little bit. And I actually found that this improved the views quite a bit. And I've still used a few of these off and on over the years. So that was another example of some of the really unusual things we did in those days. Okay, the next to last of these 6 telescopes that I started with was pretty interesting. the Celestron 8 came on the scene around 1970 and became really popular. Leonard Nimoy there advertising it. Well, I had one, but mine was a do-it-yourself. So this is a picture of it on the right. And there's kind of an interesting story about it. In 1971, I went to the Astronomical League convention in Memphis. And lo and behold, I won the first prize, the door prize, which was a set of Celestron 8 optics. And I think Celestron probably thought the person who won it would just turn it in, get a discount and buy a Celestron 8. But oh no, what did I do? I decided to make myself my own 8-inch SCT, and that says a long adventure followed. So I bought some parts from a company that made Cassegrain parts, and I had them machine me a big mount for my my 8-inch Schmidt corrector. And when it arrived and I tried to put it together, I discovered that I hadn't measured it quite right, and the opening to mount the Schmidt corrector plate wasn't quite big enough. And at the time, I was living with a couple of roommates who were dental students, and they had a dental drill in the kitchen that they used to do, make dentures and things for projects. So I sat there for a couple hours and grinding the excess material off my Schmidt corrector plate, and eventually got that to fit. Then I put the telescope together, and the images weren't quite right. And I finally discovered that the optics had pits in it, and it was actually a flawed optics set. So I contacted Celestron, and they said, well, okay, we'll sell you a new set cheap. So I bought it, and eventually I got my 8-inch DIY SCD together, and it was my main Hubble telescope for almost 15 years. And so that was quite the adventure. Some of these old stories are probably hard to believe for new people and have such wonderful things to buy. Okay, the last interesting one I thought I'd mention is I had a folded 4-inch f/15 refractor for a while. I don't have a picture of it, so I threw a picture in. So it was a 4-inch f/15, and it had a flat at the bottom, and the eyepiece came to a focus up in the middle of the tube, and it was on a nice altazimuth mount. So it was ergonomically very wonderful and light. And the neat thing about it was the eyepiece was almost always in the same position above the Altaz mount. But the guy who made it that I bought it from wanted it back, so I sold it back. Okay, so let's move on to part two. So in 1973, I went to the University of Texas to get a PhD in computer science, which was my field primarily. And as a result of that, I took a class in the astronomy department at UT, ended up getting a job part-time at McDonald doing software, and got into a program where I was an interdisciplinary student in both computer science and astronomy. And for the next 5 years as a grad student, I got involved in some fantastic work with the early solid state detectors and some advanced instrumentation, and ultimately did a really neat project on galaxy redshifts. And so my dissertation was entitled Astronomical Spectroscopy Through Real-Time Computer Control of Photodiode Array Detectors. So this is an aerial view of McDonald, 82-inch telescope on the left, 107-inch on the right, and the background Hobby Eberly telescope. And we'll talk about those some more as we proceed, because I've had significant involvement with all of those. This is another really neat picture that one of our employees took when there was a rainbow basically covering the HET and the 107-inch. But the McDonald had the second and third largest telescopes in the world when these three telescopes were dedicated in 1939, 1968, and 1997. So it was a real privilege to get involved in this. So this is a picture of the 107-inch dome from the 82-inch dome, built in the 60s. Picture of the telescope, and it's a massive thing from the 60s. It's a really wonderful telescope, but it's from a different era of technology, and I did a lot of things with it. And I summarized those. So back in the 70s, when I was doing software for McDonald in parallel with software as a graduate student, I wrote a bunch of software for the spectrographs at McDonald, some imaging software. I wrote 2 autoguiders, a large Cassegrain software. And as time went on and I got into management, I was involved in project management for some upgrades, and later on as a volunteer, I still go back and do spring break tours and various admin roles. So my real break in astronomy professionally came when I got involved with Dr. Robert Tull, who was the chief optical designer and building the 107-inch telescope and chief instrumentation developer for the telescope. And he had a program that developed some new detectors called self-scan digicons for the big Q-day spectrograph of the 107-inch. So I got involved in a team with Bob Tull, Steve Vogt, another grad student, and this is a paper we did later on using these self-scan digicon for faint object spectroscopy, and this is how I really got going in astronomy. So this is a picture of a reticon from about 1973 or 4 when I started, and a reticon was one of the early solid-state detectors, an integrated circuit, and it was like a long shift register. They had photodiodes that were sensitive to light, and you'd read them out serially into a computer, and these were at a very high quantum efficiency and were very effective for bright objects. But if you did faint objects, there was quite a bit of readout noise. So what Dr. Tull did is in conjunction with a company in San Diego, he developed a thing called the self-scan digicon, where he used these detectors in an image intensifier tube. This is a schematic. So if you look at the left, there's a photocathode. So the light from the object would hit the photocathode. Photons would liberate electrons. The tube had a high voltage of 30,000 volts, and it accelerated the signal. And they were focused on the back where this reticon was mounted. And then there was circuitry, electronics to read it out into a computer. And I wrote all the software to do this. And that was a big part of what I did as a graduate student. There's a note at the bottom. In about 1977, when we had this on the 82-inch telescope, one night they had a mechanical refrigerator, and that failed. And at the time, we were doing twice a week small plane trips between Austin and 400 miles away, the observatory. And so we couldn't get a spare for a second day sent on the airplane, and 2 other grad students were there. So we had a free night on the 82-inch in the spring, observing galaxies on the 82-inch, probably my best or one of my best visual observing nights ever. So this is an abstract from that paper. I won't go through it, but I'll show you some more things I did with it shortly. But the whole goal of the software I wrote was to optimize the performance of it and provide real-time information to the user. Okay, so this is the second telescope there that I mentioned, the 82-inch. Fantastic telescope from the 1930s. At the time, the second largest in the world. And as part of my graduate work, I did a galaxy redshift observing program. And I'll explain that shortly. This is another neat photo of the 82-inch from the 107-inch one night when they had the lights on showing the Milky Way in the background. It's a beautiful sight if you're at McDonald. So a project I did as a graduate student was to build a system to do redshifts of galaxies with the self-scan digicon detector on the 82-inch telescope. And it involved taking the spectra, doing some processing with Fourier transforms and cross correlations, and eventually computing redshifts for a set of galaxies. So let me briefly describe the process. I actually still have in my files the view graph I did by hand back in the late 70s when I did a talk about this. But the short story on the whole thing was I had 15 nights on the 82-inch, and this is basically my favorite 82-inch memory, observing a group of standard galaxies to demonstrate the system works. I had 2 redshift standard galaxies that set the scale for what redshifts were, and did lots of observations. And then you had to, in the reduction, do heliocentric corrections to correct all the redshifts to the sun, and do typical processing like people do now in astroimaging with flat fielding and so on and so forth. And then do Fourier filtering and processing, which I'll explain briefly here. So this is what my spectra look like. The top spectrum is one of my 2 standard galaxies, NGC 3115, and that looks pretty much like a standard typical absorption line spectrum from a star. You see some of the Balmer lines, H beta, H gamma, et cetera. Some other lines from calcium, iron, magnesium, and so on and so forth. And so you take a spectra of each galaxy and to do a cross correlation, which is a mathematical shifting to determine the extent to which the spectrum of the program object is shifted, which is the redshift. You had to first take out that low frequency continuum component. And so the second one you see is how I did that by taking the Fourier transform of the spectrum, filtering out the low frequencies, and then the inverse transform, and it put it on a flat scale without the continuum. And then the third one, because redshift is wavelength dependent, the further out you go out in the red, the more a given line is redshifted. You had to transform it to a logarithmic wavelength scale. And then you did the cross correlation and created, and there are a lot more details, but you created your redshift answer. And before I did all my program galaxies, I wanted to prove the system works. And so this is an example of doing that, where on the x-axis are the redshifts of known program galaxies, on the y-axis are the redshifts I got in the 45-degree correlation line. So I proved it all worked and then had a program on a set of unknown galaxies. Okay, so that pretty much ended the second phase of this, where I was a graduate student. The third part involves the main part of my McDonald career that extended until 2007, when I retired. And in addition to all of my activities professionally with the telescopes, I did a lot of amateur activities in parallel, so I'll kind of throw a few of those in. And by the 80s, and especially into the 90s, we started getting into a lot of non-traditional telescopes on the big telescopes, international partnerships, new things like you'll see a beautiful big segmented primary, and telescopes with totally different operations models. In the amateur world, we started getting Appos and Dobsonians, and then of course public outreach really got going then. And as Mehmet said in the introduction, I had 4 different jobs. First programmer, then I was the computing manager for 13 years, and then assistant director and superintendent. So the next one I threw in is another little amateur telescope I did, another second little 3-inch RFT. And this is kind of weird, because back around 1970 or thereabouts, there were actually people that wanted to make bigger binoculars by taking a smaller binocular, like a 7x35, and taking the objectives out and putting it in 2 telescope tubes with bigger objectives. So I bought a second lens and made a second little RFT with the intent of making some do-it-yourself binoculars, but I never did it, so I ended up with this little telescope. But the thing that I remember most about this is in the 80s and 90s, I had a locker in the 107-inch dome, and when I'd be out there working on telescope projects in the daytime, I'd sometimes go up and put it on the roof of the extension of the 107-inch dome and do some observing with it. And I remember in 85 and 86 watching Halley's Comet with that. So now we fast forward to 1986. And that's when I decided to buy an Astrophysics 6-inch apochromat, 6-inch f8 apochromat. And that was about the time when Appos really started coming into play, and Astrophysics made a pretty big splash when they came out with this telescope. And so I sold my old 6-inch and my 8-inch and all my Sky telescopes, and threw in some more money and bought this telescope in 1986. Wonderful telescope, pretty heavy and just solid as a rock. Like I say, built like a tank, and it's now a classic, but it was my main telescope for almost 15 years. Just to illustrate the kind of technology that existed then and compared with now, this is the mount on it. So it's got a 6-inch gear, stainless steel axes. You'll see the 2 counterweights are stainless steel. They've got threads on them, so you can rotate the counterweights and make fine adjustments in the balancing. And it's a really beautiful mount, but really old-fashioned. I still have it, don't use it much, but so this is kind of when the Apo craze started, as far as I'm concerned. There are two other small telescopes, what we call small telescopes in McDonald, a 30-inch and a 36-inch. I put a slide in for each just for completeness. When I was a grad student, I had 13 nights doing photometry on the 30-inch back in the 70s as part of a class. And we were actually able to do thousandth of a magnitude accuracy photometry by doing differential photometry with alternating between two, very carefully between two standard stars and a program star. And that's one of my best memories. The other one is once I got into management back in the early 90s, there was a graduate student that did a neat project to transform this telescope into a very fast prime focus imaging system. And so he built a prime focus corrector on the top end that, don't remember the exact focal ratio, but it was about f3, and what was a pretty state-of-the-art CCD system at the back end, and it made a really good upgrade. So 30-inch f3 imaging system, the modern CCD, was pretty good back around in the early 90s. You made one little boo-boo. It turns out the top end was too long and it could hit some dome motors in the top of the dome. So McDonald asked the College of Natural Sciences at UT for the money to build a new dome. Sure enough, they gave us about 75 or 80,000. So I got the job to have the old dome removed and taken to our visitor center. And I bought a new dome for it and a control building. And that was one of my projects and fond memories of that. So the dome went from a 20-foot dome to a 24-inch. The other neat old telescope in McDonald's, a 36-inch from the 50s. And I've got great memories of that too. No longer used for research for a long time, but it's a fantastic public outreach telescope, still used for that now. And for several decades, McDonald people's been entertaining VIPs with star parties with this. But my favorite story about that is in the late 90s, the control system on it, which had been done by a couple of McDonald engineers in the 80s, they were afraid that it was going to die because of Y2K. Just when everybody else, about 1998, when everybody else was getting worried. And McDonald had an elder hostel program. And one night they took the elder hostel group to the 36-inch and they were explaining they were afraid this was going to die in a year or two when Y2K hit. And lo and behold, one of the people in that program volunteered to give us $30,000 to build a new control system by hiring a contractor. And of course, I was in management again, so I drew that job too. So I found a contractor that replaced all of that. My favorite memory on that, I think, is the Y2K fix. All right, so let's move on to the Hobby Everly telescope. This is a huge telescope, a very impressive telescope, built at fairly low cost relative to its size, and very innovative telescope. And I spent quite a bit of time working on that in the early phases, particularly once the serious work implementing it went into it. But this was a totally different beast because this got us into international partnerships. And the original UT Austin was the main partner with close to 60% of the time, and Penn State had about 25 to 30% of the time, and we needed more partners. And we found two partners in Germany and Munich and Göttingen, and we also had Stanford. So we got the telescope initial version working and dedicated in 1997. This is a big display outside of today. They've since done a large upgrade in the last 5 to 10 years for a project to study dark energy. And in the course of that, enlarged the number of partners: Texas A&M, Potsdam in Germany, a group in England, Max Planck in Germany, National Science Foundation. I'm not sure what Tokyo has to do with it, but this gives you an idea of the different ball game you get in when you get into these big new projects that are international in nature. But this is a really unusual telescope, and what it is an Arecibo style optical telescope. So that means it sits at a fixed angle of 35 degrees to the zenith. And during observations, the telescope structure is fixed and the objects move across the focal plane at the top of the telescope. So the main moving component becomes this large tracker system in the top end of the telescope. And then, of course, you have a limited field of view doing that. And the way you see different parts of the sky is between observations, you rotate the telescope in azimuth, set it down, and as you rotate it in azimuth, it sweeps out a strip in declination that you can observe with the telescope. And by doing this, you can see about 70% of the sky, but it eliminates a large amount of the complexity from having a large moving telescope and focusing a lot of the action in the top end of the telescope. The other main thing is it has a segmented mirror with 91 components. And this tracker is on the left, it says six axis tracker, quite complicated. Obviously it tracks an X and Y, but the focal plane, because the large mirror is spherical, is highly curved. And the optics at the top end have to stay perpendicular to the mirror. So that there's two angular axes and a position angle axis. So the software for this guy, for controlling the mirror, for Q scheduling and doing observations is all very, very new and unusual. So this is a picture of the primary mirror, 11 meters by 10. So that's almost 35 meters long. And each of those segments is an individual mirror that's 1 meter long. And well, they weigh about 250 pounds, a couple of inches thick. And each one has 3 actuators on the back. So take 91 mirrors times 3 actuators. There's 273 degrees of freedom in controlling the alignment of all these mirrors. There actually there's a person down in the lower left for scale. So this is an amazing thing to see, one of these 10-meter class mirrors. So the thing in addition to the early phases of software definition and requirements definition and all that, my job in the early part of the project was to worry about how this telescope was used. And I got to do 2 papers. One was at a robotic telescope symposium in Tucson, talking about the unusual nature of this telescope and how we would operate it. And the second one was a year later in Hawaii. And if you look in the upper left, this conference was called New Observing Modes for the New Century. So in the 90s, really, other big observatories were really strongly thinking about new ways to build and use telescopes that had a very different departure from traditional telescopes. So in summary, on the HET, I did a lot of the initial work. I actually, through my management job, I was in charge of budget preparation for what we prepared for the UT administration to get approval to do this. And after it was done, of course, not everything worked. So we set down on a project to improve the dome, add louvers for natural ventilation. We put this reflective material over the dome. And the original open loop control system for aligning the mirror didn't really work right. So we had a big project to install sensors on all the edges between these 91 segments. And so I had a management role in all of that. And the final thing I note on there is because UT put most of the money into this completion project, we had to work with the partners to get some additional observing time and modify the legal agreements. And that was successful, but I must admit that was one of the hardest things I ever did, convincing the partners to give up some observing time because we put a lot of extra money in it. Okay, so let's move back to reality and amateur telescopes. I finally decided I should get into Dobsonians. And so this is a 10-inch I got in the early 2000s, a really nice little telescope. And I discovered that what a lot of amateurs have discovered, really good sweet spot between aperture, portability, cost, and giving nice observations. I had it in McDonald. It worked great there. I eventually sold it and I think it worked up at Big Bend National, ended up at Big Bend. And I started buying more refractors then. First one I got was an 80 millimeter f9 from Stellar View, and I eventually used it on a solar telescope with a Herschel wedge and a Lunt telescope, and that made a really nice solar telescope. The next unusual telescope I'm going to show you had to do with another project I got involved with in my project management duties for McDonald. And in the early 2000s, we built a new big visitor center at McDonald. And this is an aerial view of it, 13,000 feet, very unusual. It had a lot of elements from Chaco Canyon archaeoastronomy built into the design of it. And so I was the project manager for building this, but one of the things that was designed into it was a telescope to take real-time images of the sun and produce a fairly high resolution image of the sun, spectrum of the sun in the visitor gallery. So you see that little dome on the roof on the left. Let's move on. So this is an example of star parties at night at the visitor center. Been highly successful for public outreach. But this next view, I'm going to talk about this telescope just because this is I would say equally different and interesting to the Hobby Everly telescope and fun to work on. So what this telescope did is, and I summarized it in this screen, so let's talk about it. On the roof, there was a heliostat, pretty standard, a 9-inch refractor objective that was about f100, very long focal length, 45-degree mirror, a hole in the roof that sent this beam down inside the building. And if I go back to the previous slide, in the middle of the lobby, there's a big post, and at the top of it's another 45-degree mirror that sends the beam along the top of the lobby toward the exhibit hall. The one on the right shows a really neat group of baffles for the beam of this telescope. And eventually it ends up in the exhibit hall. And to get the idea of what the observer saw at the end, this is a picture of what you see in the exhibit hall. At the top is a screen where an image of the sun is formed. In the middle is a spectrum that's produced, and the bottom is a key for various spectral lines in the sun. But at the top on the screen, there's a long slit, and behind it's a mirror, and what the part of the sun that doesn't appear as the image is reflected back into a spectrograph we built. And this spectrograph, I won't go into details, but it then threw a really nice high resolution spectrum back onto this screen. And the neat thing about this is we had a joystick and a movable screen, and the slit you can see at the top, you could open it wide up and that would reduce the resolution of the spectrum, but make it brighter by letting more light in. Or you could close it way down to a really narrow slit, and that increased the resolution, but it made it fainter. And the team we had to do this had to interface this to this building under construction, make all the dimensions work out. And it was a really fun project. All right, part 4, let's move on to this. In the course of all my McDonald employment, I got involved in 4 different international telescope projects, which were quite interesting. So I'm going to do a little bit about each of those because they were all based on pretty interesting telescopes in their own right. And of course, these involve scientific cooperation. And this is when we got into remote and robotic operation, fundamental use of the internet, and cultural differences really started coming into play in some of this. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is probably my favorite of all. So back in the early days, in 1981, we had a professor of astronomy at the University of Texas that did instrumentation. And in the late 70s, he decided to emigrate with his family to Israel, and he became an astronomy professor at Tel Aviv University. And so they wanted him to copy our self-scan Digicon, put it on a spectrograph, and duplicate our system for faint object spectroscopy on this telescope, which is a 48-inch telescope of WISE Observatory, which is in the Negev Desert in the southern part of Israel. And so what happened was, and this I would say, he's no longer living, but this would be highly immoral today. He decided to use my software without asking. And so he took a binary copy of it to Israel, and that's basically never told me he was doing that. And so they built a spectrograph, the Digicon system, computer system and interface, put it all together, and it didn't work. And so they had all these horrible problems. We had a series of letters in the 1980s about what was wrong with it. And of course, what do you think they decided? It must be the software, right? And all they had was a binary. So they negotiated with me and said, you must come to Israel and fix it. And so we negotiated, and they thought this is pretty serious problems. And so we agreed I'd go to Israel for 23 days and work there till we made it work. Well, so I went to Israel, got to Tel Aviv University, got to their lab where they had the system set up and sat down and started working. And after about 15 minutes, I said, I'm not sure your timing system and clock system is working right. Can you tell me how you built the interface for these clock signals that go into the computer? And their engineer explained it, and I said, oh, that's not right. This signal is supposed to do this, not that. And their engineer said, oh, really? Oh, I can fix that. I can change one wire and it'll make it work like you said. So I said, okay. So he powered the system down, took the interface out of the computer, goes off for 15 minutes, comes back, puts it back in the computer. We fire it up and it works like a champ. So within 1 hour, the whole system worked perfectly. And I was there for 23 days. And it turned out they didn't really have a data system to handle their data and get it into their bigger computers to reduce it. So I spent the next couple of weeks building a data system for them. So the whole thing was a smashing success, and they got way more than they were expecting. And I got 5 days to travel around Israel and a 3-day trip to their observatory. And I spent 8 days exploring Israel, and that was probably my favorite overall international story. This is a picture of where the observatory is in Mitzpe Rimon in the Negev Desert. Quite an experience. Okay, the second one, I'm actually go to the second slide first. Because of the HET was built at a fairly low cost and quite innovative, we got several inquiries from other observatories to help them because they were interested in either copying it or copying some parts of it. One of those came from China, where a group in Nanjing was building a telescope called LAMOST, which stood for Large Area Multi-Object Spectroscopic Telescope, that would use 2 big segmented mirrors similar to the HET. And going back, so this is kind of a summary of what LAMOST was. And so we were contacted by this team, and our director decided we would host them and work with them on and trying to help them with LAMOST. And so I got assigned to be the McDonald liaison to LAMOST. So they sent a group of engineers to Texas, and I organized some meetings and information and arranged a trip for them to McDonald to see the HET. And they eventually built the telescope and went into operation near Beijing. And it's basically a Schmidt telescope with a large segmented mirror that acts as a Schmidt corrector and a segmented primary. And going back to the next slide, if you look in the lower right, there's basically a big segmented mirror like a heliostat that acts like a Schmidt corrector. And then that sends the light up to the top left off a big spherical segmented primary, kind of like an SCT, down to a focal plane. And in the focal plane, there's a big fiber optic system. I think it had 4,000 fibers, which sent the light down to this big spectrograph system at the basement. And it was 5-meter aperture and could do 4,000 spectra in parallel. And that was their design goal. And so as a result of that, I got invited to go to China. And in China, this is the director of the project and a model of the telescope, kind of turned around left to right. So I spent about 11 days in China visiting institute in Nanjing and also the Beijing Observatory, giving a couple of talks and consulting with them. That was quite the experience. This next picture, they had prototype segmented mirrors like the HET had, and here I am with several of their people. I took a picture of the group of us reflected off the primary mirror. And one of the few times you'll ever see me in a coat and tie, but I did it on that trip. In Nanjing, where the headquarters were, and this is in the year 2000, they had a factory that was building big telescopes and refractor telescopes. And one of the neat things I found was they were building a lot of big refractors for installation in public observatories in big cities around China. And these were pretty big. I think they were 8-inch telescopes. They might have been 6-inch refractors. And this was kind of neat what they were doing. And I got to do a number of days of sightseeing also. Purple Mountain Observatory is near Nanjing, so that was pretty interesting, and a lot of other sightseeing. And I got to go to the Beijing Observatory and the Great Wall and all that. And they got to go visit the biggest telescope in China at the time, which was the 2.1 meter telescope at Beijing Observatory. Okay, the third of these four projects is in South Africa, called the SALT telescope, or the Southern African Large Telescope. And the South Africans wanted to build a large telescope at low cost. And they were very interested in the HET, and they basically decided to build a second generation clone of the HET telescope at the South African Astronomical Observatory. So this is a picture from their website of the completed dome and facility. And just like that previous telescope, I was assigned to be the liaison and work with their team that came to Austin and organize some meetings and various things. And so, as I said, I was the liaison. And the deal that the HET made was we would provide all of our plans, a lot of design input to them, a lot of information about the lessons learned, what we did right on HET, what we didn't, what they should change, consulting. And in exchange for this, HET, the consortium, would get 10% of the SALT time for 10 years. And so as a result of that, I got to go to the groundbreaking in South Africa also in 2000. And so this is 4 hours north of Cape Town, up at the Sutherland at the South SAAO. And this was a fabulous experience also. The groundbreaking ceremony, the first thing they did is had a native group of singers come in and do native folk songs and things. That was quite interesting. So that kind of sets the tone for how different this was. Then once we got to the site, they had all these flags set up and another international project. And the director, who was my boss, used to make jokes about that going to the SALT board meeting was like going to a meeting of the United Nations. Of course, they had South Africa, and in the US, we had Texas and Penn State. Rutgers University in New Jersey and University of Wisconsin were also involved. There was a group in England, our German partners. There was somebody in Poland and somebody in New Zealand. So this was incredible, international this thing was. And because they had all these foreigners there, and they were very interested in basically in leveraging this into public outreach and helping their educational system with children and so on. One day they organized something called the Collateral Benefits Workshop in Cape Town. And so I went to that, and that was one of the most interesting days of my life, watching how this thing unfolded. And to give you a couple of examples of what this was like, they were saying, well, we need, we have all these social problems in South Africa and all these, quote, tribal groups out around in South Africa that we want to raise up and educate and so forth. And so people said, well, we have all these, somebody from Penn State said, well, we have a lot of good computers that, we upgrade them every couple of years. We could send you a lot of used PCs that are quite good. Maybe your people, these groups could use these. And their response was, oh, that'd be great, but these places don't have electricity. And then somebody else said from McDonald's, you may have heard Stardate, which is this long-running, award-winning radio program McDonald's been doing since the 1970s. The person who was in charge of Stardate said, oh, well, we could translate our Stardate programs and we could run them in South Africa for public outreach. And the response to that was, well, that would be great, but what language would be used? There are 13 different languages used, and all these groups were trying to help. And so that's just a flavor of the Collateral Benefits Workshop. So the whole thing was highly interesting. So finally, they did the groundbreaking, and they're about to do the honors, and to do the shovels. They had school children of South Africa do the groundbreaking ceremony. Okay, so the last one of these four interesting international experiences was with a telescope in Germany called MONET, where MONET stands for Monitoring Network of Telescopes. And we had the German partners in Göttingen with the Hobby Everly telescope, and they decided they wanted to build a robotic telescope. And and site one of them at McDonald and one in South Africa. And so they created this project, and it had an interesting paradigm. The paradigm was that they wanted to have German school children use it in the daytime when they were in school. And because of the time difference of 7 hours between Germany and Texas, if it were in operation at McDonald at night, it would be daytime in Germany in schools. So they got funding from the Krups Foundation in Germany. And that's the same Krups from the coffee makers you may have been familiar with, 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I got the funding to build these two telescopes and build them, and they'd be robotically operated and in South Africa and Texas. And so as a result of that, I got to do a couple of trips to Germany for design review, telescope acceptance, so on. And one of the interesting things that happened that was really kind of neat was that when we went for the design review, it turned out that the company in Germany called Halfmann that was building the telescope had just finished an almost identical telescope for Hamburg Observatory in the north of Germany. And so they'd arranged a trip for the group to go up to Hamburg and look at this telescope. Well, unbeknownst to me, once we got there, turns out that Bernhard Schmidt of the Schmidt Corrector fame and SCT telescopes was from the Hamburg Observatory. And they had a little museum dedicated to Bernhard Schmidt. And it had prototypes that he had used in developing Schmidt correctors and various documents and design things. And that was one of the cool experiences I had as a result of the Monet project. Okay, the final slide about Monet is, this is what a beautiful picture of it at night. They chose a really unusual enclosure design that was kind of like a barn. They actually had quite a bit of mechanical problems with it. And overall, the telescope in the initial phases wasn't the most successful thing, but they're still at it. And 20 years later, all of the people that worked on this are retired, and there's a new group, and they're building new instruments and reinvigorating this. But this is one of the first robotic telescopes that remotely operated at McDonald. Okay, so now we're on to the last part of the talk. And I think I'm doing pretty good. I think I'm within about 10 minutes of 1 hour. So let's zip through the last part of this, and then we'll do Q&A. So I finally retired in 2007, been retired for 14 years, and I continue to do a lot of telescope activities. I summarized them here. Like I said, I keep buying telescopes because I like them and they're good and have fun with them and do a lot of observing. I got into astrotourism in lots of different countries and interested in telescope history and finding that out. Done a lot of volunteering, and I've been doing a lot of imaging from my house during the pandemic. Okay, so the next thing I bought in 2005 is I decided I needed a bigger Dobsonian, so I went out and bought a 15-inch Discovery, one of these split tube designs. So the tube splits in two parts. It all comes in three parts. You can take the top end off. It's got nice handles. And then you can take the bottom end off, which has the primary. You can move the base, put the mirror assembly back on, the top on, and literally in about 3 minutes, you can move it from inside to outside. And it's sized such that, and I figured this all out in advance, everything goes through a standard sized door. Can all be pretty much handled by a single person with all the really good handles. And it's f4.2, and that's because at the height, the focuser is right at 6 feet. So no ladders are involved. So I bought this telescope, and I had it at McDonald for the last year and a half or so before I retired, and fantastic under a dark site. And so here it's shown at a star party in Austin with my granddaughter, who was about 3 years old at the time. She's 10 now. This is another picture of it. I have a Honda Element that actually fits in that. It's not truly portable like a truss tube, but out in far west Texas at Marathon, which is a really good dark site. Okay, the next refractor I bought was in 2008. And the reason I bought this was, remember in 2008, we had the Great Recession. And in September, October, November, December, the economy was just in free fall and business was hurting and everybody was hurting. And I decided I wanted another refractor, and Orion dropped the price of this by a couple $100. So I said, okay, great. It's a bargain, I'll buy it. And so I bought this, and turns out to be a really neat telescope, very versatile, rich field. It does imaging. And I actually used it at Glacier National Park the next year. So that was my next refractor. And the next telescope I got, and this is a good example of how you sometimes end up with telescopes and people wonder, why do you have that telescope? And well, the reason has nothing to do with telescopes. Well, I was a basketball player all my life until October 2011. I had a really bad shoulder injury in basketball, and had a 6 centimeter rotator cuff tear, shoulder surgery, and literally for 2 years I could not raise my elbow up above my head. And so this is a fairly light telescope, nice handle, pretty good aperture, looked like it had a lot of good attributes. And I decided I could manipulate it with my left arm and left hand and use my right hand to support it and operate it. And that turned out to be true. So I went out and bought this, and turns out it's been a really good telescope, lightweight, unbelievably good collimation. I've never collimated, and it's still in perfect collimation. People criticize the Spider because it's kind of thick, but it turns out that it's a casting and it just holds its collimation. I live where there tends to be quite a bit of humidity and dew, so it's open tube, that's good. It's got a built-in corrector in front of the smaller corrector lens in front of the secondary. So it's a nice wide field. It's great for outreach and EAA. And so that's been a really good telescope. Okay, and the last one, well, that's not quite the last one I'm going to show. I like that one a lot. So a few years later, I went out and bought the big brother, the VMC 260L from Vixen, which is the same design. And that's been a really good telescope, shown here on an Ioptron mount. And this is a terrific telescope, more or less equivalent to a Celestron 9.25 or a Celestron 11, but pretty comparable. A couple more telescopes. I bought a Skywatcher 120 refractor doublet, ED doublet, and that's been a really good telescope. And I took that to the eclipse in 2017. My wife there and her brother and sister and friend, and I keep buying these good telescopes, and I like them a lot, and I don't sell them. And the last one I'm going to show, my last two purchases, finally decided had to have a Takahashi. So I bought a 4-inch Takahashi fluorite. That's the bigger of the two. And about a year ago, I bought a little Astronomic 72 millimeter ED, and I put them together, and haven't done it yet, but I'm going to take them to a dark site like Big Bend pretty soon. And I decided this would be an ultimate RFT, basically. Low power eyepiece will give about 18 power on the Takahashi. The DSLR, which is full frame, give fantastic images in 25 or 30 seconds. So that's my last telescope purchase. In the last year and a half, I've started using my Nikon DSLR a lot with all these different telescopes in my yard and driveway during the pandemic. Just to give you an idea, and this is probably not news to a lot of you who do astrophotography or EAA, but even that little 3-inch telescope with this Nikon full frame CMOS camera and a good L-enhanced Opto-Long L-enhanced filter with a single 25 second exposure it's amazing what you can see with this. On the left, that's the Lagoon Nebula, the Trifid and star cluster. And you can even, in that amount of time, you can even pick up the veil. Of course, these are nothing like I can do if I start doing real longer exposure with live stacking and, typical software for processing them. But it's amazing what you can do with a small telescope in a big city. Austin is now at least 2.3 million people, and I live pretty near the center of it. So I have Bortle 9 sky, or Bortle 8 maybe at best, and it's amazing what you can do. Okay, the last two segments we'll zip through here. First one's astrotourism and then volunteering. So my wife is a longtime French prof at the University of Texas, taught French there for nearly 40 years. And last 18 years, she was in charge of the UT French department's study abroad in France summer program, seven-week program where the students spent a week in Paris of orientation, and then 6 weeks in Lyon of intensive study and a couple of courses. So until I retired in 2007, I'd go to France for 2 weeks vacation. And then once I retired, I started spending 7 or 8 weeks in France with her. And that's when eventually, that's when I really started doing a lot of exploring in France. And finally, in 2014, I decided I would spend a week exploring Paris and seeing how much I could find that was of interest in astronomical history and what the French call lieux de mémoire. Pardon my French, but that means places of memory. If you spend much time in France, you'll discover they've saved all kinds of historical things, plaques everywhere commemorating things. So I did this for a week in Paris, and I produced a talk that I've done 3 times. That the latest one I call "Footloose Astronomer in Paris," and it's about that week of exploring Paris. This is just one example. So I went and found Messier's grave in Père Lachaise, and where Messier worked, which was in this tower at what's now the National Museum of the Middle Ages, and near the center of Paris, called the Cluny Museum. And the neat thing on the lower right was when I was there was a little one of the little things you find in magazines for subscription, and there were 2 rocks, and it was on Messier's grave. So I took a picture of it. It was a Sky and Telescope subscription card. And lo and behold, about 3 months later, I opened my Sky and Telescope. Somebody wrote a letter and said he'd been to Paris back in early May, and he left a little memento in Charles Messier's grave. I took a picture of it. I almost wrote a letter to a Sky and Telescope, sending him the picture of this, and said, well, yeah, indeed, I found it. Here's a picture. But I never did. Anyway, so I'd love to give that talk sometime. That's one of my favorite talks. There are a lot of interesting things in Paris. There are old telescopes at the Paris Observatory. These are examples, Gregorian telescope from the 18th century, one of Foucault's telescopes. He's famous in astronomy for several things, and lots of interesting stuff in Paris. In the course of my travels in France, I also discovered French are very artistic, and you find a lot of interesting artistic things related to Paris. One of my favorites, this picture on the left at the Lyon Observatory in Lyon. There's my wife, and we went out to an open house when we were in Lyon with her program, and they'd taken an old telescope that was no longer used at the Lyon Observatory. I think it was an 18-inch telescope on a fork mount, and an art professor at the university had about 10 students do an art project, turning it into this piece of art on the grounds of the Lyon Observatory, and it's really impressive and beautiful. Big museum in Paris, built in the Art Deco era, the 30s, had this beautiful entrance, kind of an Art Deco sign, discovered in the Orsay Museum with a lot of impressionists. There's the original of Van Gogh's Starry Night. And so, yeah, even studying art and astronomy in France is a fun thing. I've done some other trips to England and seen things in Germany and some other places, Italy. And these are an example of 2 of the telescopes and things I've talked about in several of the talks I've done about astrotourism. The one on the left is in Bath, England, a copy of the telescope Herschel used when he discovered Uranus in 1781. And the one on top is not a copy, but the real telescope that was used to discover Neptune in 1846. And that's in Munich at the Deutsches Museum, when Leverrier predicted the existence of Neptune based on irregularities in solar system orbits, and Galilei discovered it. Another place I visited is in Florence, the Galileo Museum. It has a lot of other interesting old things. It has a really great collection of old telescopes, and these are some of my favorites: a big refractor, 3 old Newtonians, and and some fabulous things in that museum. And one other thing I'd show, in April 2017, we took the Sky and Telescope astronomy tour to Chile, and that's another form of astrotourism. We visited a number of interesting places. This is the European Southern Observatory in La Silla, very interesting. The next one is the Cerro Tololo Observatory, which is the southern twin of Kitt Peak National Observatory in Chile. This is one of my favorite photos with the the lower part of the Andes Mountains before you get to the high mountains below Cerro Tololo. And that was a fabulous trip. And one of the other things we did on that trip was we visited four observatories in the south that catered to the public and did public outreach and observing of the southern sky with anywhere from 12 to 28 inch telescopes. So the observing was fabulous. All 4 nights were perfect. And this one's in San Pedro de Atacama in the north. And so that's the best observing I've had in the Southern Hemisphere. Okay, one segment left and I'm done. Maybe a touch over an hour. In 2009, after I was retired, I decided to apply to be a National Park Service astronomy volunteer. So I did that. And first year I went to Glacier National Park in August and September. There I am with the solar filter on my telescope. In 2009, the International Year of Astronomy. And when I was there, we did some solar observing, but for those who remember, there was a period of 60 odd days when there were 0 sunspots in the solar minimum of 2009. And that's when we were observing the sun. So I spent 3 weeks explaining to people why there were no sunspots, but it's a beautiful image anyway. One of the neat things about doing national park volunteering is you have some free time and you get to explore all kinds of neat things. This is one of my favorite photographs in Glacier. If you've been there, it's Mini Glacier in the northeast part of the park. Reflections at sunset off of Swift Current Lake. So great experiences in parks, not just astronomy. And then after 1 year, there was an opening at Black Canyon for an astronomy volunteer, and that's much closer to where I live. My wife's also from Colorado, so I applied for that and started going to Black Canyon. And most of the years since 2010, except for the pandemic, I've done 4 weeks in August at Black Canyon. This is a picture looking upstream from Black Canyon. Beautiful, beautiful sight, not the deepest part of the park. This is an example looking down into the main part of the park. 13 miles of the steepest part of the canyon is in the middle of the park. Their motto is deep, steep, and narrow, and it's kind of scary but beautiful, and they have a great astronomy program. So I've been doing star parties there for a long time. This is one in either 2010 or 11. I had my 15-inch, there was a 20-inch, another. This fellow had a 20-inch and a 13-inch. So there's a really good local club, the Black Canyon Astronomical Society, that participates, and I've been doing talks for them for about 8 years now. And so they have a really good program, and I keep going back there. There I am a couple of years ago with my 10-inch as it's getting dark. I've also taken my refractor there. This is kind of a plug for like a 5-inch refractor. They do really well for public outreach, and this all looks pretty familiar to a lot of you. This typical lineup for an August star party at Black Canyon. I threw on here just an example of how you do interpretation of the park with visitors. It's just kind of fun. The Black Canyon of the Gunnison is really impressive. It's almost 2,800 feet deep at its deepest. And whenever I show them the Andromeda Galaxy, Messier 31, I usually ask them, which do you think took longer, the light to get here from the Andromeda Galaxy or the Black Canyon of the Gunnison to form? And they've all seen the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, and it's a couple thousand feet deep, and it's getting deeper like the width of a hair every year. And most of them say, I think it took longer for the Andromeda Light Galaxy to get here. Well, it turns out they're correct. The Andromeda Galaxy is now considered to be about 2.5 million light years away. Black Canyon of the Gunnison took about 2 million years to form. And so it's fun to interact with visitors. It's also great working with the rangers. This is one of my favorite photos. In the parks, a lot of these rangers that do astronomy, they give them the nickname Dark Rangers and have a motto, half the park is after dark. And a couple of years ago, this on the right, one of the astronomy ranger, it was his last night and he was moving to a different park. And I think it had rained that day and the observing area there is not concrete or anything. And it gets some puddles in it. And part of the observing preparation process is get a shovel and move some dirt into the puddles. And so the ranger came in and they had a shovel and just spontaneously they struck an American Gothic pose. So I took some pictures and I called it Black Canyon Gothic. Okay, last park, I live in Texas, so I'd like to do some volunteering at Black Canyon in 2016, the 100th anniversary of Black Canyon. 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. I got to do a couple of events there. This is doing solar observing in the Chisos Mountains at Big Bend. This is a famous feature, the window in the Chisos Basin, Big Bend National Park. So I got to do a star party with my wife in the viewing area of the window. This is a picture of that as it's getting dark. I had my Vixen 10-inch telescope and some people starting to show up with the window on the left. And that was one of the best star parties I've ever done. So finally, down to the next to last slide, I've done a lot of volunteering and my wife also at the star parties at McDonald. There we are some years back with my Vixen telescope. So down to my last slide. And I want to say thanks for listening, but I saw a guy at a star party once with this t-shirt. Said, money can't buy you happiness, but it can buy you telescope. That's kind of the same thing. So if you've never seen that before, I think that's kind of fun. So I want to say thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And I think we're going to have a little Q&A session now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Mehmet's going to take over. And I hope you enjoyed my talk.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much. You definitely had a very exciting, very interesting career and life with the telescopes and observing, and probably people are jealous of this. Let me start with my question, which is somewhat personal maybe, but how did you get your wife approve all these purchases?
Oh, well, I'm not sure she did, actually. I have a passion for telescopes. And, she comes with me on astronomy adventures. And she enjoys doing astronomy and has done some volunteering too. And I go with her to France all the time and help her. So it's kind of a joint thing. We do it together. And before the thing started, you talked about being an investor. Well, I took up investing a long time ago, back in the 1980s. And I kind of do it as a hobby now. And I've been pretty successful as an investor. So, I can buy plenty of things without any worry about what they cost. So getting approval, like a lot of, people need to do is not really an issue.
Okay, that's good. That's a relief.
I just do it for fun and I can keep moving from one thing to the next. And
the reason is this is a very expensive hobby. And of course you have taken it to a certain degree of, I may say to the extreme maybe, but
well, I will say, and a couple of my friends in the Black Canyon Astronomy Society have really nice observatories, and I'm guessing those cost $75,000 to $100,000. And if I lived in a nice site, I'd probably build an observatory. But I live fairly near the central part of a city that's not quite as big as Denver, but pretty close, and there's not much point in building an observatory where I live in my yard. And I'd say probably the biggest single expense I've ever made for a telescope or any astronomy equipment is probably $3,000.
Maybe another investment could be to move to a remote location, buy a new place, sell your existing one, and then build your observatory.
I could do that, but I have lots of interests, and I'm not a big fan of real estate. So I think I'd rather take my money and go out to dark sites and
Okay.
stay in nice places rather than buying more real estate.
I'll let other people ask questions. Anyone who would like to pose a question to Phil, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. This is not actually a question, but I think you'll find it relevant.
Mhm.
Many, many years ago, Celestron used to take broken telescope parts to the Riverside Telescope Makers Convention in
Wow.
California. And over a few decades, I purchased an entire telescope in parts. Parts had been in at least 8 other telescopes.
Mhm.
And so I assembled it and I used my C8, and I've been claiming until tonight that I was the only person who ever built their own Celestron C8. But I guess I'm the second one.
And now there are 2 of us. That brings up an interesting thing. Comment I'd make when I went through Chile and we went to San Pedro de Atacama, a little town in the far north of Chile. There's a huge amount of astrotourism, and you walk around this little town. There were at least 8 or 10 places that advertised astronomy tours. Like a couple hours, we'll go out and do telescope observing. And there was one of them that had a Celestron 8 with this cracked. It was amazing. This cracked corrector plate, and they basically all those people did is they took their old broken telescopes and used them for advertising. So I can sympathize with that.
Jack is saying something. Jack?
Oh, yeah, on the building of an 8-inch SCT,
Mhm.
we had a contract out there to build some special, extremely short focal length 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrains. And I decided we're going to make, I think the requirement was for 6 of them, and I made 7 of the darn things. We needed a backup, was my excuse. And when it was all said and done, I ended up with the optics for a 8-inch f1.5 primary, f12 overall. Unfortunately, it was broken and disappeared, but that was well, I shouldn't say homemade. I was the optician over there at Celestron at the time, back in 1963.
Mhm. Oh, wow. Well, I really enjoyed that telescope, and I used it for almost 15 years before I sold it. So in the end, it was quite successful.
Yeah, Tom took pity on me. I told him about the broken. They didn't have the tooling to those short focus. He ended up sending me an 8-inch orange tube 8-inch, and I think he knew that I was squeamish about optics because I tested this thing, and the optics in it were darn near perfect. I think he didn't want to send me one that was full of zones and whatnot.
Mhm. Yeah, a good 8-inch Cassegrain can be awfully good. That's my opinion.
Tale of 2 Tinsley Cassegrains that I'd never been a fan of the classical Cassegrain.
Mhm.
Most of them I'd seen were pretty terrible. And one of the guys in the LA Astronomical Society had an 8-inch Tinsley. And I looked through that thing and good grief, Alvin Clark quality images. I mean, it was unbelievable.
Mhm.
And I asked him, how come your telescope is so good? He said 27 trips back to Tinsley.
Oh, wow.
Beat him over the head and they finally did it right.
Well, I read Cloudy Nights quite a bit for fun. And over the years, you'll discover that because these things like Celestrons are mass-produced telescopes, there's a variation in quality. You'll often see people say, well, if you got one with really good optics, never sell it, keep it, because some people get some that are not so good. So I think the good ones are really good. And just like my 8-inch Vixen, it's about a 2.5 or 3-inch 2-element corrector that's in the secondary assembly. So the secondary is protected by this 2-element corrector that gives it a wide flat field, and that takes the role of the 8-inch corrector in a classical Schmidt-Cassegrain. So there's different ways to do that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I had a fellow in Goldendale, Washington, had an 8-inch Tinsley f8 reflector, Newtonian,
Mhm.
8-inch f8. Okay, how that be? He was going to donate it to John Briggs Lyceum down in Magdalena.
Mhm.
Well, I'm about halfway, so he dumped it in my front yard. It stayed in my front yard. It's an 8-inch F8 Newtonian. How big a mess can that be? I think this thing weighed in at over 500 pounds.
Mhm.
We couldn't. His wife and I and my neighbor were barely able to bully the mount up into my front yard, and it's going to be a front yard ornament. Nobody's going to walk off with it. And about a week later, John came up and somehow we got it up into his truck. And but boy, that thing was heavy.
Mhm. Well, it may not have been obvious to my talk as I went through it, but back in 2005, 16 years ago, when I bought this Discovery 15-inch split tube Dobsonian, ever since then, I've been thinking about how to simplify how I do my visual observing, buy things that are lighter, easier to use. You know, like a lot of people, I've gone mostly to Altaz mounts and lighter OTAs whenever possible, and starting to really focus on ergonomics as I knew I'd get older, and very important part of observing.
Yeah, I've been there, been bitten by that snake.
Oh, yeah. Other
Okay.
questions?
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you very much, Phil. We very much appreciate, and wishing everyone happy Thanksgiving and good night.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Excellent presentation. Enjoyed every bit of it.